And we're back. It's been a few weeks since we last got together. Wanted to give you an update on the current conditions on the ground in Shanghai, where nothing is quite what it seems. You might recall from the last webinar, if you attended, I called it the Chinese Hall of Mirrors. And that was kind of a riff on the Palais du Versailles, which is a very beautiful, ornate hallway that was to celebrate the economy, the politics, and the art or culture of France. And what I see in the Hall of Mirrors is something very fragile, gilded, and empty. And in some ways, that's what we've had here over the past month. Now, things are starting to get back on track. We are trying to understand precisely what that means. Some things don't quite make sense. So while we have pandemonium in the West, namely America, Italy, increasingly Spain, and other places, things seem eerily fine here, which begs a number of questions about what's really going on. Lots of talk about flattening the curve. You can't flatten it to the point it's concave, which is what would have had to happen to have the current scene here, which is people roaming, being, living, and working freely all around China. Increasingly, we have less and less checkpoints, and people are not dying in the streets, as we believe to have seen in Wuhan, terribly, as seems to be happening in Italy, frighteningly. It's just not happening. Is there something special about Shanghai? Is there something special about Wuhan or Italy? Something doesn't make sense. What it could be is some kind of larger test or presentation for society, for people. Again, the most kind of well-coordinated stress test of humanity that we've ever seen. And China has, generally it seems, passed the test. It's not so clear other countries will. Now, one of the reasons that China will pass the test goes beyond their kind of genetic resilience, as I talked about last time. It includes a number of factors. One is that China as a whole is a net saver country, meaning that virtually everybody I know has, millions of RMB tucked away under the bed somewhere. And I'm not talking about well-to-do people. The average Chinese has savings as part of the culture. They don't rely on the government, financially anyway, to take care of them, in dark times. So the average Chinese might have 1 million RMB, which is about 150,000 US dollars. The more affluent Chinese might have between 10, 50, 100 million RMB for a rainy day. What that means is, in real dollars and real survival terms, is they can go 6 months, 1 year, 2 years possibly, kind of without much of a problem. I mean, they can get by. They can get by quite nicely on what they have in their reserves. So no hoarding, no cash crunch, even if the salaries stop. Now, let's compare and contrast that to America, which is a net debtor culture. Some numbers suggest that upwards of 40% of Americans have less than 1 month of savings. 1 month of savings available to take care of themselves and their family in times of peril. So a very, very different situation, not as elastic, not as resilient. Tough times ahead. I don't know how America will pass the test in the same way China has. At the risk of seeming overly conspiratorial, we are seeing a number of operations around the grand test or the grand presentation. For example, we're seeing major law enforcement initiatives in the West, in the East, to scoop up criminal figures from all over. It seems that certain sectors in government are full steam ahead. In fact, taking advantage of a quasi-martial law situation around the globe. It almost suggests there's a much greater coordination exists than by individual country. There seems to be a greater transcendent hand involved. Would also like to, as Scott Adams says, talk about one of the dogs that is not barking. And one of the dogs that is not barking is India. It's kind of curious, even with NASSCOM. NASSCOM is one of the largest computer technology shows in the world. While most fairs, expositions, and shows were canceled over the past month, they went full steam ahead with it, and does not seem to be a problem whatsoever. Does not seem to be a problem with their leaders, their politicians, their religious leaders, or the population. One has to wonder why. Now, I've actually had this conversation with some Indian friends, and they've had some very interesting perspectives on it, ranging from, again, arch conspiratorial to religion, religious differences, to medicinal techniques, turmeric, for example, as being kind of one of the miracle compounds, roots of the Indian culture, and other things as well. So the bottom line is there is more going on here than we can understand. Keep all options open in terms of how we deal with this, how we steel our bodies, prepare, and remain strong. I'm somewhat not excited to report that some of my main predictions seem to be coming true, or more true, ones that were scoffed at for obvious reasons even just a few weeks ago. But I originally called this the $1 trillion virus, much to the howls of laughter of many. It clearly is a $1 trillion virus, or whatever it is, and not just 1 trillion, but many trillions. I've also talked about this in terms of time relative to recovery. My thinking has changed over the past number of weeks, but I've been fairly right, and that is we're not talking about days and weeks, we're talking about months and years. So I think I said at one point, best case scenario is this is a 1-year crisis, worst case scenario is this is a decade crisis. It's a multi-year crisis, so let's hope it's on the lower end of that spectrum, but it's not going to go away quickly. It's not going to correct or self-correct. I don't anticipate a V-shaped recovery per se, or a U-shaped recovery. In fact, I call it the mirrored L recovery, if you can get that in your mind. So we still have a way down to go. We have not hit bottom from any perspective, across any industry, across any culture. Lots of growing, lots of learning, lots of transformation happening to all of us in real time. So with that, I want to sign off and wish everybody well. Stay strong, be ready as best you can, physically, spiritually, any way you can with your family. And hopefully in time, we find out who we are and become maybe an even better people as we get through this together.